Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Lorraine, and you?
Excellent. So, would you please state your name?
Ruth Pelletier.
Ruth, please tell us where you were born and where you grew up.
Well, I was actually born in Ottawa. I lived there till I was about a year and a half, and then I came back to my grandmother and aunts and uncles' property in Brownsburg, Quebec, Lower Laurentians.
Ruth, would you tell us about your line of work before you arrived at Alliance Quebec?
How much time do you have?
The big picture.
Geriatrics with the Douglas Hospital, known as the Verdun Protestant back in those days. And then when I was having young children, I did waitress work at the Brown Derby and A&W and Chez Desjardins, and did consumer protection. And that led me to a radio career for about 6 years. And from that, I went to Alliance Quebec.
Thank you. And how and why did you get involved with Alliance Quebec?
I had attended several of their conventions as an individual, not representing anybody particularly. And when I was at CJD, I brought Royal Lower in as the president for the exchange program, and Russell Williams came along with them because it was in February and it was bad weather, and just in case Royal couldn't get in from the townships. And as Russell was sitting talking to me when Royal was on the station, on air with Joe Cannon, he said, "Do you like it here? You want to come work for Alliance Quebec?" And he says, "I need your CV right away." He said that Saturday they were doing interviews. And so I submitted it to him. I got called in. First time I ever had an interview with multiple people sitting there. And I had to go through 2 of them because they couldn't keep the position filled. It was quite long and involved, and weekend work, night work, traveling. And I got hired, and the rest is history. I was there 12 and a half years.
Wow. So, Ruth, tell us when you started, what year, and what was the name of your position? Do you know?
Sure. I started in late February, 1987, and I was there till 1999. And my first position was community development, but working with mainland Quebec. So I was responsible for the chapters in the regions. And it was a good fit because I'm a rural girl coming from the country, so I could relate to the people living in rural Quebec and what their needs were, lack of numbers and strength and services that were being available.
And did you go on to other positions, or that was the one you occupied?
No, I stayed in that position the whole time for about 7.5 years, but after about 2.5 years, they added on the on-island chapters, which was Southwest, Saint Laurent, Laval, South Shore, Montreal Centre, the West Island. So I had the whole sector of community development with all the chapters at that point.
Ruth, could you tell us what your positions were over the years at Alliance Quebec and what the titles of the jobs were?
Sure. I started as the community development person for mainland Quebec. So that was basically overseeing and being the communication link between head office in Montreal and the chapters in rural Quebec. And I did that for the whole time I was basically there. But about 2.5 years after starting, I was also asked to take on the entire community development department, which included the on-island chapters, which was the Greater Montreal, South Shore, Laval, Montreal Centre, Southwest, West Island, which I did also. And then about 1995, 96, 95, I became the assistant executive director, assisting David Birnbaum, who was the executive director at that point. And David left the organization in probably 97, and I took over as executive director till I left in 1999.
What were the top 3 issues you worked on during your time at AQ?
Well, I think because I was that link between the chapters and the community and the provincial office, I probably was involved in every file. But I would say the top 3 was community development, ensuring that the citizens, English-speaking Quebecers in the regions and in their local communities felt comfortable, felt they had a sense of belonging, that there was a place for them, people understood their needs, and that the directors at the provincial office were taking that into account when they were planning and strategizing and lobbying for certain policy change. Number 1 priority has always been for the English-speaking community, and continues to be so today, is access to health and social services in English. And when I say that, it's a service in clinics and with your doctor in the hospitals, but it's also the literature. And then another thing that was very important, and we did the Rosemere city was one of the tests, was the bilingual cities, where they had a strong enough percentage of demographics were English-speaking members of that municipality that it would be granted bilingual status. And I think one of the fun things, if I can add that on, was that approximately every 2 years we did a lobby day. And that would be scripts would be prepared, volunteers would come in from the chapters, and everybody had the same script, and we would go in groups of 3. 1 would be taking notes, and 2 would be asking the questions, and there was a backup person. And the same questions were asked of every member of the National Assembly and every member of the Parliament. So 1 year it would be Ottawa, 1 year it would be Quebec City, and it would be, say, 3 of the key major factors that the community was concerned about and wanted to bring to the government's attention. One of them being not invoking the notwithstanding clause again in Quebec.
So you've done different jobs over the years at Alliance Quebec, but could you describe in one of those positions a day in the life of working there, and how did it change under different boards?
First, I think you'll be shocked to know that the board of directors for Alliance Quebec was 41 people. That's a massive board. It had to have representation from the regional associations, from the chapters, from institutions like Concordia, Dawson, McGill, English-speaking Catholic Council. So there was elections and they were chosen. So let's say you're planning a community development seminar, which was one of the things I was able to get funding from the federal government for. We had 2 a year. And the regions, or all the chapters, voted and picked their 6 delegates. They came in and we covered the expense. And it was to be sure that we had the proper presenters, the proper topics. We were doing workshops, so it would give people information and tools, be it fundraising, how to put a newsletter together, how to lobby. And anything can go awry when you're planning an event. So that would proved to be interesting. Arranging for volunteers to pick them up at the airport and get them to the hotel. That could be a day. We would always have program directors meetings. Now I would be traveling probably about 3 days out of the week. And I would often be working at night because chapters would have board meetings, annual general meetings on the weekend, so that they could accommodate their volunteers or people who were working. So we would have program directors meeting and we would be discussing files, be it health and social service, be it education, be it employment. We formed the JOEY project, Job Opportunities for English Youth, which now you know it as YES, Youth Employment Services. That was a baby of Alliance Quebec. So it was ensuring that what we were deciding at the provincial office, trying to take all the factors and all the players into account, government legislation, potential legislation, policy change. What were the needs? They differed in West Island compared to, say, Baie-Comeau, Jonquière. So it could prove to be very interesting. And in the midst of all this, we were often getting bomb threats and we were firebombed. So in the mix, we had very exciting days.
I think I should take a little segue there. Can you tell us in a short anecdote about that day of the firebombing?
That was horrific, and we were very fortunate. We were on Crescent Street, and it was December the 22nd, so the offices were closed for the Christmas break, but two of the secretaries were in that office that day wrapping up some last-minute work. And all of a sudden, our phones are ringing, and we're being told that the office had been firebombed. And I mean, basically, the innards of the offices were gutted. Our library was gone. Our my office was destroyed. You know, and we did not know, but Quebec was filming. The government or the police force had cameras across the street filming our office building, and they were doing the same with the Saint Jean Baptiste Society, but none of us were aware of this. So they had some film of the day, and they had a picture of the individual. So police and firemen were checking with us, could we identify the person, which we couldn't. We had to set up incognito office space at the Nouvelle Hotel on Dorchester then, now René Lévesque, and St. Matthew. And actually David Birnbaum was hired to start work right after the New Year's break. And he shows up outside this hotel room. I don't know where to go. You come in here. So it was quite intriguing and quite interesting.
In the literature about Alliance Quebec, there has been a bit of criticism of its focus on rights, rather than, for instance, economic development. Do you think that is fair?
No, I don't think it's fair, but I can probably understand why certain people feel that. You know, people have their specific need or niche and they gravitate to that. But when you look at the overall picture, I think Alliance Quebec did a fair job, a very good job. It was internationally well known. First of all, it was lobbying to protect the English community's rights and its history and its contribution. We played with all levels of government, be it the separatist, Pequist government or the Liberals. When people say, well, you didn't pay enough attention to economic development, that's not true, because it would have been, and don't quote me on the year, probably the very early 90s when Pierre Pettigrew was the minister. We signed an entente with Ottawa that an envelope of money that was aimed to go to Quebec for economic development, that there would be a definite percentage of it held back and protected for the English community in order for it to be able to address its economic development and needs. And that's where you had, it originally was named the Community Table. It's now called CEDEC, C-E-D-E-C, Canadian Economic Development and Employability Corporation, I believe. And it's been doing marvelously well since its conception. And so we did, and youth employment services, because we knew that the youth, if we wanted to keep them in Quebec, and you know, we did ensure that our young people were going to French immersion. My kids did half their schooling in total French, that they were bilingual so that they could stay in Quebec, because those of us who remained love Quebec. We like Quebec. We want to contribute. Some have more French than others because they've had more opportunities to use it. But, you know, our youth employment was a desperate need and continues to be so. But youth employment services has gone great way forward to help with entrepreneurship and get yourself hired and stay here.
Related to that question, what was the place of labor or workers or the working class in the organization? Did Alliance Quebec promote, for example, working class organizing between different linguistic groups? In other words, was the focus on English, or did they promote workers' rights, union, inter-union organizing across language lines?
There was a postal strike back in the years, and I know Alliance Quebec came out in support of the workers. Within the chapter structure, we had all levels of affluency, education, backgrounds, so people at the community level intermixed and intertwined. As far as down and dirty with the Francophone unions and the English unions, I can't say that that occurred to any great degree, but we always worked very closely with Fédération des francophones aînés et aînées du Canada, because they're the French minority in the rest of Canada. And in fact, we supported them tremendously, very forcefully, vocally, for the Montfort Hospital in Ottawa. So we've always had that link, and we continue to today to have that link with Fédération des aînés francophones du Canada. So there, and the needs are very much the same. The only thing is, it's the language delivery.
And when you say we continue to do that, who continues to do that today?
Well, I'm going to speak from my personal experience, and that would be Seniors Action Quebec, and I'm sure the Quebec Community Groups Network does. But I can tell you, when I founded Seniors Action Quebec, we dealt a lot with Jean-Luc Racine and continued to do so. In fact, we were invited to speak to about 40 different department heads of the federal government. And Jean-Luc was making a presentation, and I was making a presentation on the English seniors in Quebec. And we had not spoken, compared notes at all in advance. And we got in, and we both made our presentations, and I can remember a gentleman saying, "Oh, Moses, c'est les mêmes problèmes." It's the same problems, it's the same issues, and it's very true, and it probably continues to today.
That leads us nicely into the next question. Tell us about the relationship of Alliance Quebec with Francophones in Quebec.
That is very different depending where you're living. I can speak particularly to mainland Quebec. In regions like Rouyn-Noranda, the English and the French seem to live two different solitudes. The French had their community, their church, their schools, their activities, and the English had theirs. And what we did was we organized on an annual basis a souper québécoise. And we sold tickets, and it was a bit of a fundraiser, but it was to bring the two communities together. Nothing more than good food, good music will bring people together. So we would have a local French restaurant prepare and serve the food, and we'd have the real Quebecois singers and musicians come and play, and it was marvelous, absolutely marvelous, and it began to break down the barriers. Now take a community that's about an hour drive away, Val-d'Or, and the two communities intermix beautifully. They're more advanced, I would say, economically. The French families and English families babysat each other's children, intermarried, went to each other's weddings and christenings. So there was no hiccups whatsoever there. So it depends where you live.
You gave examples of different places north of Montreal. How about on the island? Were there structural links between Alliance Quebec and Francophone groups in the province? In other words, you know, different, let's say, community groups or I can't.
I can't say that there necessarily were. I would say the difference with the Greater Montreal region is that fortunately, unfortunately, some people may say that Montreal being sort of the hub economically, that you had the business center that were fluently bilingual. So people would float back and forth in the two languages. It didn't seem to be a big issue. I can't say that I have seen where, besides the intermarriage, the Irish and the French, you know, they make great couples, that there was that us actually going out of our way to really connect or intermesh with the French community. I would say there's more of that with the young people today in the CEGEP University, international students, that there seems to be a mix, and probably more fluency in the two languages has helped with that.
And how about between Alliance, like in terms of what was the relationship between Alliance Quebec and some of the regional groups? Now, I've looked at the very complex structure of Alliance Quebec, that I know there were chapters in regions, and then there were regional groups such as CASA that were affiliated. Do you have any comments to make about the relationship between basically head office and the structure of Alliance Quebec and the regions?
Sure. When Alliance Quebec was first formed, we have to always remember that there had been an organization called Positive Action, and they were affiliated a lot more with regional associations, and that would have included the Magdalen Islands, Gaspé, CASA, Outaouais Alliance, well, that was their name after, but Outaouais, I'm going blank now, Voices of English Quebec, and the Townshippers Association. So they were formed before Alliance Quebec, and they were doing their thing for their community. All of a sudden, we have Eric Moldoff and Michael Goldblum, Alex Kay from Positive Action came, and Peter Blakey, and they formed, and Graham DeCarry, this new organization called Alliance Quebec. And basically, the concept behind that was to bring everybody into the same tent. Power is with numbers, give you a stronger voice. And I think the regional associations, for a period of time, in fairness to them, felt, well, who are you coming and, you're telling us? And they talked, and it was before my time. They talked, and they obviously worked things out. And the regional associations became members of Alliance Quebec. They did their own thing locally. Like when I say I was in community development and involved with the chapters, I was not any link between the regional associations, although I had friends, and we would talk. But they did their own thing. They had their own staff. They had their own funding. And then Alliance Quebec formed Coasters, which is Blanc à Blanc Tabacherie, because there was no representation whatsoever there. And at the same time, we had institutions like Concordia, English-Speaking Catholic Council, Dawson McGill, Quebec Writers Federation, ELAN, English Language Arts. They all became a unit of Alliance Quebec. So when we would say that, and they took a membership, and when we would say that we represented, X number of thousands of people, we actually did, because they were members. And they participated in our convention, our community development seminars. We had an advisory board, which was key people who knew the community, knew the law, had different expertise that would meet. They didn't tell us what to do, but we listened to them, and they heard what we were up against. So it was a dialogue.
And you also had some regional chapters. Were those in areas where there were not regional groups, or was there overlap between?
The regional chapters were formed later.
I see.
You're talking about the regional development network that there is now?
Regional chapters of Alliance Quebec. There were regional chapters, Southwest Montreal.
They were chapters of Alliance Quebec. We geographically gave them a title.
Right.
So Southwest would have included Pointe St. Charles, Verdun, LaSalle.
Yeah.
Montreal Centre would have been Montreal Centre. We had one in Ville Saint Laurent. We had one in Laval. But they were all part of Alliance Quebec. Alliance Quebec provided this part-time community animators.
Yeah.
And they were part of our network.
Were there any of those off island, or they were all on?
Yeah, they were all chapters. They're all chapters.
Yeah, but sorry. Let's say
you're saying
in Gaspé, was there also a separate regional chapter of Alliance Quebec?
No.
It was only where there weren't those regional groups.
You had your regional associations. And you had your chapters.
I see. And I'm interested particularly in Verdun.
Yes.
So that was part of the Southwest chapter.
Right.
Any memories, anecdotes about that particular chapter?
Not from my wearing the Alliance Quebec hat. Another hat, maybe. No, they were very connected. There was a lot of need for educational rights and to ensure that they had access to bilingual services, immersion classes, etc. Economic development was always important, and to make them feel that they were part of the unit. Because in that area right now, Pointe St. Charles and Verdun is more, it's built up, it's more affluent. But back in the day, it wasn't the affluent sector of the community. So they had some very basic needs, health and social services, especially social services, activities for young kids.
Ruth, thanks for explaining more about the links with the regional groups. Some of them split off from Alliance Quebec in the 90s. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Okay, that would be towards the latter 90s, probably about 98. And about May of 97, there had been a run for presidency of Alliance Quebec. And it was between Constance Middleton Hope, who had been the president, and Bill Johnson, a well-known columnist with the Montreal Gazette. And he had always looked upon Alliance Quebec as being the lamb lobby, that we were too moderate, we negotiated too much with Quebec, we didn't stand tough enough. And it was the days of Howard Galganoff as well. The Angry Anglophones was the title that he walked around with. And so there was a real split amongst the community, because you had community that were demanding more, and you had the community that felt, no, the moderate approach was the better one to do. Why were people who retired from Alliance Quebec always going to the Liberal Party? Well, the answer to that one was, well, what party would you like us to go? We had learned to strategize, to lobby. We knew the political scene. We aren't going to go to necessarily a separatist party. So they went to the Liberals. So there was a lot of criticism, and there was a lot of split amongst chapters. And not only chapters in rural Quebec, it was chapters like the West Island. It was quite bad there. You had people who had been involved with, Clifford Lincoln when he was provincial, when he was federal. You had people that were supporters of Jeff Kelly. They had their links with the political decision makers, but then you had this, for lack of a better term, more vocal grouping that wanted to blow it wide open. It became almost impossible. And I mentioned earlier that we had a board of 41 people. Well, when that election took place, the first one, Bill Johnson did not he got elected as president. He did not take the additional 7-9 seats of the executive, so he was a lame duck at the executive with the day-to-day operations. On the board, where there was the total 41, including the president, 22 of them were the constant Middleton hope, and the balance was Bill Johnson. So you had a real split. You would have a board meeting on a Saturday morning, and you would have approval of the agenda, approval of the minutes, and then you go to your financial statements. You start at 9 o'clock in the morning. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you were lucky if you were adapting and voting on the financial statements. It was just insane, not healthy, really just terrible. Staff were caught in the middle. The working conditions became intolerable. That's when David Birnbaum publicly, through announcement at the Gazette, that he was leaving, couldn't take it. So there was a big question of who was going to apply and who was going to get the position. So it was agreed that I would try to get it if they would even hire me, more or less to be there as a watchdog for the staff. So they did hire me, and it went from bad to worse. I was being told, 2 mornings out of the week, I want you to fire this staff person, that staff person. They could have been there 6 years, 9 years, never had a complaint. There was no reason, no justification, no legality in which to let them go, so it was not pleasant. And then the board couldn't deal with it anymore, so the 22 on the board said, well, we're leaving. We're sorry. I said, please, you can't just walk out and leave us here in limbo. I got staff that are falling apart. So they were very kind, and they composed a letter, because in those years, to get unemployment insurance, now employment insurance, was to have intolerable working conditions. If you just left the job, you got penalized. You did not get even EI. So they gave us a letter, and they all signed that letter, gave it to me. I made copies, confidential, personal, hid it under people's blotters, told them the next morning, there's something, one by one, there's something under your blotter, open it in private, and you're not to discuss it within the building. Because the president was still there, and he had an office in that building. And the 22 board people publicly held a press conference and announced they were leaving. And so I stayed for about another 1.5 years as ED. And then Canadian Heritage, after a couple of years of basically all the staff left, and they put in their friends and their new people. And Canadian Heritage pulled the plug financially.
That was my next question. Why did Alliance Quebec cease to exist? So it was precisely the story you just told me.
Yes, and I had been instructed a couple of years before that, when we still had the full board complement. We had the 2 groups trying to work things out. I had been instructed by the executive to go and speak to Canadian Heritage and tell them the lay of the land. And I did, but good bureaucrats and confidentiality and whatnot, they listened to me, and they didn't say anything, and they didn't do anything. And then years later, because we heard that people who were supposed to be volunteers were paying themselves, I don't know everything that went on. My heartbreak is that all the documents ended up in an individual's home who has since passed away. And Lord knows where they are, all the beautiful briefs that were presented and newspaper articles, etc. So eventually the Canadian Heritage said, there isn't a cohesive representation, so we're going to stop the funding. And a number of years later, because I had worked at the Canadian Continence Foundation for 7.5 years. I was doing fundraising for a Lebanese church, and I got a call from Martin Murphy, who had been and was the executive director of English-Speaking Catholic Council, who was the president of the Quebec Community Groups Network, which was basically a step forward. They had been located in Quebec and were planning to come to Montreal. They were, for lack of a better term, a mini Alliance Quebec, but not the same structure at that point in time. And they were trying to hold a unit together. And I was asked, would I go and work on the Greater Montreal Community Development Initiative, which was to have focus groups and analyze the Greater Montreal area that had no funding. Back in those days, it was about 79% of the English community was located in this region, or regions, and they had no funding and no representation. Could we get the players and the organizations, individuals, to indicate that they wanted to have a structure? What did they want that structure to do and represent them, and then come up with a plan and make a formal request to Canadian Heritage. So they gave us 3 years funding in which to carry out that study. And I was hired by the QCGN, who were just locating in Montreal, to do that project, which we did. And that's where now their budget was increased to incorporate representation for the Greater Montreal area.
So at that point, when you were hired by QCGN, you had left Alliance Quebec?
Oh, I had gone from Alliance
Yes,
Quebec in
okay.
1999.
Yes.
I had worked at the Canadian Continence Foundation as ED for 7 years. So it was like about 2006, 07, I was at the QCGN.
Okay, thank you. Ruth, how did being in Alliance Quebec affect your life afterwards?
Well, when I was going through the hostile takeover, and I have no other word to express it, I was seeing a psychologist for stress management, and he says, you made Alliance Quebec your extended family. So I'd put everything in it, and I was heartbroken. I was losing all these friends throughout the province. I was losing my staff. I was going to have to make a decision. He says, you have to leave. That you cannot deal with stress. If you don't leave, you're going to come out in a box. So I did, but I think what it left with me was, I think I always had some of it, but a great understanding for a different mix of people. The well-educated, the less educated, the poor, the rich, the politicians, the businessman, doesn't matter to me, they're people. And the importance of being bilingual. I knew that when I went to work there. My kids are bilingual, grandkids, great-grandkids are bilingual. And it's very, very important. And I feel for Quebec. I mean, I don't like some of the stuff that's going on. But if somebody criticizes Quebec, I'll come to its defense. So it's sort of like the mother. I know what my kids do wrong, but don't tell me. And I think it made me, I found Alliance Quebec was great at training, teaching you to be open-minded, strategize, learn the political scene, and be able to take all those factors into account. Like, people are very critical of certain elements of our federal government currently. And I sit there and I look and I say, yeah, but this was done to avoid this from happening. This is done to promote sure, we got a big deficit. Yeah, we're going to have to pay. But what is the other scenario if we don't do it? So I think it's given me the ability, I hope, to sort of look at all sides.
Here, Ruth, you have been active, you told me now, much before Alliance Quebec, and I know you're active today. What motivates you to continue on as a community organizer?
I put all the blame, but it's not blame. I put all the respect and acknowledgement to one teacher I had. I was not an academic student. Sports is what kept me in school. But in grade 9, I had Mr. Ronald Duncan, who was my teacher in grade 7, but also in grade 9. And I was fortunate. I went from kindergarten right up to 11 in the same building, same school. So the teachers knew you from the time you were a little tyke and when you needed to be wearing your glasses and you weren't, etc. Very different atmosphere. And on the weekends, Friday, he would send us home and say, I want you to look at a newspaper, I want you to look at a magazine, and I want you to pick an article, and I don't know who I'm going to call on Monday morning, but you're going to discuss whatever you read, whatever drew you to it, and why. So he sort of got me interested in reading and discussing and debating, and I always was one for the underdog. We had 2 French students that came in grade 9 to school, 2 French young boys, because the French community had their school, their church, they lived in their sector, and the English, the two didn't intermix. And they came to learn English, and the kids picked on them terribly. And I said I was a tomboy. I used to scrap for these 2 boys. Leave them alone. So I think it's just in the genes. I don't know where it comes from. And I always feel that I get more back than what I give. And if I can make a difference, be it poor, be it an ex-con, a homeless person, I'll do it.
Ruth, what was the influence of Alliance Quebec within the provincial government?
Oh, I think it was tremendous, actually. And I would say it was with the Liberal Party and also with the PKIS Party. We used to often say internally we got a lot more from the PKIS, the Separatist Party, than we did with the Liberals, because I think they felt guilty. But we did have the opportunity, and lobby days was very good because, you know, you're 3 people meeting with an M&A. You're not a big threat. And I think they could be sensitive to what we were saying, and they looked at us more as human beings. So I think we had a great impact with that. The Liberals, of course, were a lot of people that are chapters and are volunteers in the different communities, knew these individuals. So we had a direct link. And when you brought it down, the bread and butter issues down to the nitty-gritty, the day-to-day impact that it has on people, we're not a threat. It's just basic needs. I think you break down a lot of the barriers. It's when you go in with force and angry and demanding. We were firm, don't get me wrong, but you don't get the backs up, and right away they shut down. So I would say that those years, and that's why it's so sad to see such a highly respected, internationally known organization gone. But everything has its lifespan too.
Ruth, you mentioned when QCGN got off the ground and your role later working in QCGN. Would you say QCGN in its early years or since has managed to take over the role that Alliance Quebec had, or maybe explain a little bit how it's different and different for different times?
I think it's slightly different, and I think at the beginning, you know, everybody has their growing pains and they have to know the players and build up those networks and the links. I think it's different than Alliance Quebec, but I think they've made great strides in expanding their membership base, and they've opened it up where there's a lot more organizations, for lack of a better term, are on the fringe that are coming in, so they're getting representation. Several of the former Alliance Quebec chapters that were part originally of QCGN have left, and they have formed a regional development network. So in the regions, they're pretty well doing what they feel that their community needs. there's been a different structure. You know, they're very much into Bill 96 and the language laws and rights. So that part they're continuing, and they've got the lawyers, and it's a slow process. They're also advising and working on the Quebec English School Boards Association. I'm on the fundraising committee because they won their first court case, but Quebec has decided to appeal it. So now we have to raise the funds to pay the lawyers to fight that again. In the regions, you'll see there's even a difference with the chapter, well, the Regional Development Network, compared to what the chapters used to do. And I think COVID had a bit to do with that too. It's much more social connections, social activities, programs for kiddies where we didn't really get into that in the past. Young mothers, Quebec City has a program for newcomers coming in. Social activities, you know, quilting, cooking, luncheons. So it's the very basic, bringing the community together and basically fighting social isolation, which COVID did a real number on all age brackets with that one. And it's well received in the communities. I think people are a little bit overwhelmed with all the politics, and you know, as much as you may think there's something good, you're hearing so much that's negative, so you're wondering, and people can't deal with it. You know, they're dealing with inflation, they're dealing with aging and health issues, dealing with you know, where are they going to live, because we're in a housing crisis. So I think they want that social fun, networking and connecting together. So it is different, but the QCGN definitely has a role, you know, and they're well connected with OCAL, the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages, and you know, they'll call upon the provincial politicians as well. So I think we need them.
Ruth, do you have any last things you would like to tell us about your experience as an organizer?
Well, I think don't be judgmental. Get out there and get to know your neighbor and your community. Get involved. Use it or lose it. And I would say to the English community who is worried and fretting and discouraged, try and stay as positive as you can. By getting involved with different community organizations, it will show that you have a sense of belonging. It will feed you that need. I think it's very important that just because you're a certain age or you're you know, don't put you out to pasture, because you're a certain linguistic group, stand up for your rights, because I truly believe we need to have access to English services, and for all, English or French, because you could be suffering with mental health issues and need to be able to speak to a psychiatrist or a psychologist, social worker. You could have had a stroke and you have a speech impairment. You could have a neurological disease or Alzheimer's and you cannot function. You could come from a cultural community and your values and your beliefs and certain things that you do that's normal for your family may be perceived as, oh, you know, there's something wrong with her. We had a Korean lady once that needed help, and they went into her home, but they wanted to check into her bank accounts to see how she was. They do not discuss money with anybody else, and she really reacted very negatively. Well, right away they wanted to label her as incompetent. So, you know, we have to be open to that, and just keep staying involved and using the services, and look at yourself as though you have value and you have rights and you belong here.
Thank you.